All right, so today we are going to be talking about, well, it's a big one. It's economics. But more specifically, we're going to be looking at the two kind of fundamental branches of economics, microeconomics and macroeconomics. If you like what you hear, please like and subscribe to get more content like this. Economics basically boils down to the study of how society is managed, the production, distribution, and consumption of all the stuff we need and want, goods and services. This field of study, it goes way back to thinkers like Adam Smith and his famous book from 1778, The Wealth of Nations. Now, early economists, they kind of lumped all these activities together, but over time, economics has really split into these two main branches, microeconomics and macroeconomics. This division became, super important during the Great Depression in the 1930s. What happened then showed that just understanding how individuals act economically, like their personal choices, it wasn't enough to really explain what was going on with these massive national economic shifts. It's kind of like, how physics evolved over time. At first, it was a pretty general understanding how the world works, and then it branched out into these really specific fields like astrophysics, which studies, stars and planets and galaxies. Or you've got nuclear physics, which looks at a tiny, tiny world of atoms. Micro and macroeconomics developed in a pretty similar way. Okay, let's start with microeconomics. This branch zooms in on the economic behavior of individuals, businesses, and, single markets. It's not about entire economies all at once, but more about the smaller pieces. What's interesting is that it really digs deep into the decisions that consumers, workers, and companies make. Stuff like how much to produce, save, invest, spend, all of that, even the employment and consumption, it all factors in. Often, microeconomics looks at specific economic issues that affect individuals or maybe groups of people who share similar characteristics. Like a really basic example, you could analyze how supply and demand impact the price and, the number of smartwatches that are out there on the market. Now, on the flip side, we've got macroeconomics, and here we're taking a much broader view, like zooming out to look at the big picture. Macroeconomics is all about studying how national and international economies behave. So, for the individuals, we're thinking about large groups within, a political or social unit, like an entire country. What's key here is how laws and policies affect these big economic entities. Things like taxes, minimum wage laws, or interest rates set by central banks, they all have a huge impact on the whole system. This field investigates those big trends we see in the news all the time, things like inflation, how much is being produced overall, what we call gross production, the general level of prices in the economy, and of course, how many people are unemployed. Macroeconomics also digs into all the different policies that governments use to try to manage their economy. So it's really about understanding these big forces that shape the economic landscape. All right, so let's dive into some of the key concepts we find in microeconomics. One really important idea is called price elasticity. It's basically a measure of how much one economic variable changes when you tweak another one. Like a classic example is looking at how changing the price of a product affects how much of it people are willing to buy. What we call demand. Generally, there's this thing called the law of demand, which says that, if the price goes up, demand tends to go down, and vice versa. If the price goes down, demand usually goes up. But here's where it gets a little tricky, especially with luxury goods. Sometimes if you lower the price, it doesn't actually lead to more people wanting to buy it. And even weirder, raising the price can sometimes make the product seem even more desirable and people actually buy more of it. So sometimes a higher price tag makes people want something more, which, kind of goes against common sense. Okay, moving on to another fundamental concept in microeconomics, economies of scale. This happens when a company can make or distribute a product in larger and larger quantities, and the cost to make each individual unit goes down. Think of a car factory, right? If they're only making a handful of cars each day, each pie is going to be pretty expensive to produce because of all those fixed costs, like keeping the lights on and paying rent. But if they ramp up production and start churning out thousands of cars every day, they can usually strike better deals on all the materials they need. They can use their equipment way more efficiently, and all that usually leads to a much lower cost per car. So bigger companies biff up this built-in advantage, don't they? Makes it pretty tough for the little guys to compete. Next up, we've got the concept of opportunity cost. This is all about what you have to give up when you make a choice. It's the benefit you miss out on by picking one option over another. A simple example is if you're deciding whether to spend money on fixing up your house or investing that same money in the stock market, the opportunity cost of doing those renovations is all those potential gains you could have made if you put the money in the market instead. And it's not just individuals who have to think about this. Companies, governments, investors, they all face opportunity costs with every decision they make. Like, if If a business decides to invest in brand new machinery, they might be missing out on the chance to expand their marketing efforts. So it's easy to just focus on the direct cost of something, but it's also super important to consider what you're not getting, what you're missing out on by making that choice. It seems pretty basic, but, do people actually stop and think about this consciously when they make decisions? It's an interesting question. All right, we also need to talk about the core laws of supply and demand. The law of supply, well, it basically says that, usually there's a positive relationship between the price of something and how much of its suppliers are willing to offer. So if a product's price goes up, it becomes more profitable to make it, right? So suppliers are generally going to increase production, assuming they're making the profit, of course. Now, the law of demand, which we touched on earlier, it usually indicates if there's a negative relationship between price and the quantity demanded. Basically, as prices climb higher, consumers tend to buy less. It makes sense, right? In theory, these two forces, they kind of work together to determine something called the equilibrium price. This is the point where the quantity supplied is exactly equal to the quantity demanded. But of course, the real world is messy. Reaching this perfect balance, this equilibrium, well, it's often a lot more complicated and gets influenced by tons of factors. Things like limits on how much you can actually produce, those economies of scale we talked about, and whether there are other products out there that consumers might choose instead. This equilibrium, it sounds great in theory, but what are some of the real-world things that prevent markets from actually hitting that sweet spot? Okay, last but not least, in our macroeconomics overview, let's talk about pricing power. This basically means how much a company can hike up the price of what they're selling without scaring away customers, without causing a huge drop in demand. Companies or products that have a less steep demand curve, meaning that even if they raise prices, demand doesn't plummet, well, they've got more pricing power. There are a few reasons why they might have this power. Maybe people are super loyal to their brand, or their product is really unique and there aren't many alternatives out there. Or maybe they just dominate the market. Okay, so we've covered some of the key ideas in microeconomics. Now let's shift gears and broaden our perspective to look at macroeconomics. One of the main areas we focus on here is fiscal and monetary policies. Government use these as their primary tools to manage the overall economic growth and stability of a country. It's like their toolkit for keeping the economy on track. Fiscal policies mainly involve government spending and taxation. By adjusting how much it spends on things like infrastructure projects, education, or the military, and by tweaking tax rates for individuals and businesses, the government can try to influence how much economic activity is happening. It's like using the gas and brakes to control the speed of the economy. Monetary policies, on the other hand, are usually managed by a central bank, and they involve messing with interest rates and the overall amount of money circulating in the economy. So lowering interest rates can encourage people to borrow and spend more, while raising them can help slow down an economy that's overheating, when things are going too fast and it's getting a bit out of control. So when the central bank lowers interest rates, how does that actually work to get people buying more or businesses investing more? Within fiscal policy, the way a government sets up its taxes, well, that's a crucial element. How it chooses to tax people and businesses can have a big impact on how everyone acts economically, influencing things like investments, spending, and even the number of people who are working. Then there are regulatory policies, which are basically all those rules and restrictions the government puts on businesses. These policies play a huge role in shaping how industries function, and they can affect everything from protecting the environment to keeping workers safe on the job. And of course, in today's world, international trade policies are a big part of the macroeconomics picture. These policies cover things like trade agreements between different countries and measures like tariffs, which are taxes on imported goods. They really shape the economic relationships between nations, influencing the flow of goods, services, and money across borders. Macroeconomics also takes a close look at labor utilization, which is basically how effectively and efficiently the workforce within an economy is being used. We use metrics like unemployment rates and look at the skills and productivity of the workforce to get a sense of this. Then there's inflation, which is when you see a sustained increase in the overall price level for goods and services in an economy over time. The problem with inflation is that it chips away at the purchasing power of your money, meaning you can buy less with the same amount. Gross production refers to the total value of all the stuff, all the goods and services that are produced within an economy over a specific period, usually a year. Price levels represent the average level of prices across the board, for all goods and services in an economy. And finally, levels in unemployment show us the proportion of the workforce that's actively looking for work but just can't find a job. So if you see high gross production does that usually mean unemployment levels are going to be lower? Okay, so what are the big forces that really drive economic growth, and how do we assess the health of an economy? Well, there are a few key factors that are essential for economic growth. Investment is crucial, whether it's in research and development, building new infrastructure like roads and bridges, or improving the skills and knowledge of the workforce. That's what we call human capital. Innovation, which includes those cool technological advancements and figuring out ways to do things more efficiently, is another big driver of growth. Education is super important because it leads to a more skilled and productive workforce, right? Trade lets countries get access to products, raw materials, and resources they might not have on their own. And finally, government policies that encourage hiring, investment, and innovation can create a really positive environment for economic expansion. It's like setting the stage for businesses to thrive and the economy to grow. To get a sense of how healthy an economy is and how well it's performing, we look at several key measures. The rate of inflation, which we often measure using the Consumer Price Index (CPI), tells us how fast prices are rising. Overall price levels give us a snapshot of the general cost of things. The rate of economic growth shows us how quickly the economy's output's increasing, how much stuff we're making. National income represents the total amount of money earned by all the people living in a country within a certain period. Gross domestic product, GDP, is the total value of all the final goods and services produced within a country's borders over a specific time, usually a year. Employment levels tell us how many people are currently working. Productivity is all about how much output is produced for each unit of input, like labor or capital. It's a measure of efficiency, really. And finally, the levels of imports and exports show us how much a country is engaged with the global economy. Buying and selling stuff with other countries. Okay, so we covered micro and macro, but what about economics on a global scale? International economics tackles all the economic issues that pop up from interactions between different nations. It's a huge field that covers things like the flow of currencies between countries, providing aid to developing nations, international migration patterns, people moving from one country to another, trade agreements between groups of countries, the impact of geopolitics on economic relations, and all the different ways countries try to attract foreign investment. And lastly, let's define what we mean by an economic recession. It's basically a period when the overall economic activity takes a nosedive. You see a drop in trade and productivity across the entire economy. A common way to measure a recession is to look at a country's gross national product, GNP. If it shows a negative growth for 2 quarters in a row, well, that's usually a sign that the economy is in a recession. So to wrap things up, the forces studied by both micro and macroeconomics, they're constantly at work shaping our world and influencing the choices we make every single day. While microeconomic factors affect the decisions of individual consumers and companies, those macroeconomic factors create the bigger economic environment we all operate in through things like government spending and interest rate levels. Understanding both of these fields gives us a much better framework for analyzing and understanding economic events and all those policies governments use to try to steer the economy in the right direction. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the world of micro and macroeconomics. If you found this informative, please like and subscribe to get more insights into the forces that shape our world.